March 19, 1943. The waters off Guadalcanal lie dark and still, a mirror of black glass beneath a moonless sky. Beneath the surface, at a depth of 60 meters, the Imperial Japanese Navy submarine I-168 drifts in enforced silence. Every man aboard holds his breath. The electric motors hum at their lowest setting, barely audible even to the crew. In the control room, Commander Tanabe stands rigid, one hand gripping the periscope housing, the other pressed flat against the cool steel of the bulkhead as if he might feel the enemy's presence through the metal itself. Above them, somewhere in the darkness, an American destroyer prowls. They cannot see it. They cannot hear it. But they know it is there, circling, listening, waiting with a patience that feels almost supernatural. The sweat on Tanabe's face is cold. This is not the war he was promised. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor on that bright December morning in 1941, her submarine fleet was among the most technically advanced in the world. The I-class submarines were marvels of engineering, massive vessels capable of circumnavigating the globe, carrying seaplanes, launching surprise attacks thousands of miles from home. Japanese naval doctrine had elevated the submarine to a position of strategic importance that few other navies recognized. These underwater giants were not merely tools of commerce, raiding, or coastal defense. They were instruments of decisive battle, designed to ambush and cripple enemy capital ships before the surface fleet engaged. The submarine crews were elite, hand-picked from the finest graduates of the Naval Academy at Itajima, trained in a warrior tradition that stretched back centuries. They went to war confident in their vessels, their training, and their cause. They believed the vast Pacific Ocean would be their hunting ground, that the vastness itself would protect them, that the same waters that had isolated and safeguarded the Japanese home islands for millennia would now shield their steel predators as they stalked American convoys and warships. They were catastrophically wrong. By March of 1943, barely 16 months into the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost over 30 submarines to enemy action. Many simply vanished, failing to return from patrol, their fates unknown until decades later when researchers would piece together the fragmented records of battles fought in the deep. The crews did not die gloriously in surface engagements or dramatic torpedo duels. They died in darkness, trapped in steel coffins, hunted by an enemy they could neither see nor comprehend. They died because the Americans had mastered something the Japanese high command had fatally underestimated: the invisible walls of sound. Sonar. The word itself was an acronym: sound navigation and ranging. But to the men who operated it and the men who died because of it, it was something far more primal. It was the ability to see without eyes, to reach across miles of black water and touch an enemy vessel with invisible fingers of sound. The Americans called their system QC, later redesignated as QGB. The British called theirs ASDIC, after the Anti-Submarine Detection Investigation Committee. But regardless of name or national origin, the principle was the same: send a pulse of sound into the water, wait for it to strike something solid, measure the returning echo, and calculate distance, bearing, and movement. It was scientific. It was precise. And to an enemy who had spent centuries perfecting the art of visual observation and naval gunnery, it was witchcraft. The Japanese submarine service entered the war with excellent passive hydrophones, sensitive instruments capable of detecting the sound of distant propellers and machinery. Their operators were trained to listen, to distinguish the rhythmic thump of a destroyer's screws from the slower beat of a cargo vessel, to hear the subtle changes in pitch that indicated a target turning toward or away. But passive listening was a defensive art, useful for avoiding contact, less so for prosecuting an attack. Active sonar. The aggressive transmission of sound pulses to actively hunt an enemy was a technology the Japanese had studied but never fully embraced. Their pre-war doctrine emphasized stealth above all else. An active sonar transmission was the opposite of stealth. It announced your presence to anyone listening. It was, in the mindset of Japanese naval tacticians, an admission of weakness, a tool for those who lacked the skill to hunt silently. The Americans saw it differently. To the U.S. Navy, active sonar was a weapon, as important as the depth charge itself. By 1943, nearly every destroyer, destroyer escort, and submarine chaser in the Pacific Fleet was equipped with sophisticated sonar arrays. The operators, young men trained in specialized schools in San Diego and Key West, became hunters of extraordinary skill. They learned to read the echoes, to distinguish a submarine from a whale or a school of fish, to track a target through thermal layers and turbulent water, to predict evasive maneuvers and maintain contact even when the enemy dove deep or turned sharply. They learned to be patient, to follow an invisible prey for hours, to coordinate with other ships, to tighten the noose slowly until there was no escape. For the Japanese submarine crews, the experience of being hunted by sonar was profoundly disorienting. They had expected to fight an enemy they could observe, calculate, and outmaneuver using the traditional skills of seamanship and navigation. Instead, they found themselves stalked by phantoms. The first indication was often a metallic ping, sharp and clear, echoing through the hull like a hammer striking an iron bell. Once, maybe twice. Then silence. The American operator was confirming contact, marking the target. Then the pings would come faster, a steady rhythm, each one a reminder that the enemy knew exactly where you were, how deep, how fast, which direction. The submarine could run, but the sound would follow. It could dive deeper, but the pings would find it even at crushing depths. It could cut engines and drift silently, hoping to break contact, but the American destroyers would grid search the area methodically, sonar pinging in overlapping patterns, closing every avenue of escape. Commander Tanabe, standing in the control room of I-168, had experienced this hunt before. He had survived depth charge attacks off Midway, had felt his submarine bucked and twisted by explosions close enough to shatter light bulbs and crack pressure gauges. But this was different. The Americans were no longer dropping depth charges in desperate patterns, hoping to get lucky. They were tracking him with cold precision, adjusting their attacks based on real-time sonar data, placing each spread of charges closer than the last. He could hear them through the hull, the churning propellers passing overhead, the sudden silence as the destroyer's crew released the charges, the long seconds of waiting, and then the concussive hammer blows of detonations. Each attack walked closer. The Americans were correcting their aim. The psychological effect was devastating. Japanese submarine doctrine emphasized offensive spirit, aggressive action, the will to close with the enemy and strike regardless of risk. But how do you attack what you cannot see? How do you maintain offensive spirit when every action you take, starting engines, adjusting depth, turning toward a target, announces your position to an enemy who is already listening? The crews began to understand that they were not hunters prowling a vast ocean. They were prey, moving through water that had become a cage. The invisible walls were everywhere. The effectiveness of Allied anti-submarine warfare in the Pacific was not merely a matter of technology. It was a comprehensive system that integrated detection, communication, and coordinated attack. Coast watchers on isolated islands radioed sighting reports. Long-range patrol aircraft dropped sonobuoys, disposable listening devices that radioed back the sounds of passing submarines. Code breakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii decrypted Japanese naval messages, revealing submarine patrol routes and rendezvous points. Ships shared sonar contacts via radio, allowing multiple vessels to converge on a single target. And underpinning it all was the sonar itself, the tireless electronic sentinel that made the ocean transparent. By late 1943, American anti-submarine doctrine had evolved to ruthless efficiency. When sonar operators detected a submarine, they did not attack immediately. They maintained contact, following the submarine as it maneuvered, plotting its position on a dead reckoning tracer, a mechanical computer that continuously calculated target bearing and range. Other ships were vectored to the area, forming a barrier. Only when the submarine was boxed in, with no route, to deep water or sanctuary, did the attack commence. Depth charges rained down in carefully calculated patterns, hedgehog projectiles that arced forward from the attacking ship, exploding on contact, and conventional depth charges set to detonate at varying depths, creating a three-dimensional field of destruction. The submarine had nowhere to go. The invisible walls closed in. The Japanese recognized the threat, but could not effectively counter it. Pre-war training had not prepared crews for this type of warfare. Doctrine was revised, new tactics attempted. Submarines were ordered to run surfaced at night, diving only when aircraft were spotted, hoping to avoid sonar detection altogether. But American radar was improving too, and night-running submarines were caught on the surface by destroyers equipped with SG radar that could detect a conning tower at 15 miles. Some submarines attempted to hide in thermal layers, areas where water temperature changed rapidly, creating acoustic barriers that could deflect or scatter sonar pulses. American operators learned to adjust, angling their transducers to search beneath the layer or waiting until the submarine's air supply forced it to move. Every adaptation was countered. Every tactical innovation was met with a superior response. The symbolic object of this underwater war was not a weapon or a tool, but a sound, the sonar ping itself. To American operators, it was a familiar, almost comforting rhythm, the heartbeat of their hunt, the confirmation that their equipment was working, that they were in control. To Japanese submariners, it became the sound of doom, the metallic voice of an enemy that could not be reasoned with, evaded, or fought. It haunted their dreams when they slept in shifts between watches. It echoed in their memories when they returned to port, the lucky ones who survived. Some men reported hearing phantom pings days after leaving the combat zone, a psychological scar that never fully healed. The ping was both weapon and symbol, a reminder that the ocean was no longer a neutral medium, but had become, through American technology and doctrine, an environment wholly hostile to Japanese operations. Commander Tanabe kept I-168 silent for 3 hours, drifting at depth, the crew barely breathing, waiting for the destroyer to give up and move away. But the pings continued, steady and relentless. The American ship was not leaving. It was waiting for him to make a mistake, to run out of battery power, to be forced to surface. When the air in the submarine grew thick and stale, when men began to gasp and consciousness wavered, Tanabe had no choice. He ordered emergency surfacing. The submarine blew ballast and rocketed upward, breaking the surface in a fountain of spray. The destroyer was waiting 300 yards away, its guns already trained. The first salvo struck the conning tower before the Japanese crew could man their deck gun. I-168 survived that engagement, diving damaged and limping away under cover of a rain squall, but it would not survive the war. In July 1943, it was sunk by American destroyers off the coast of New Guinea, hunted down by sonar, depth-charged until it imploded, taking all hands to the bottom. The statistics tell the story with brutal clarity. Of the 188 submarines the Imperial Japanese Navy operated during the Second World War, 129 were lost to enemy action. The majority were sunk by American destroyers and aircraft using sonar and radar to hunt them down. Japanese submarine crews had a mortality rate exceeding 70%, one of the highest of any naval service in the war. By comparison, German U-boat crews, fighting in the Atlantic against equally sophisticated Allied defenses, had a mortality rate of around 75%. But the German campaign was stretched over 6 years and involved thousands of patrols. The Japanese submarine service was effectively annihilated in less than 4 years of Pacific combat, overwhelmed by an enemy that had turned the ocean itself into a weapon. The transformation in Japanese submarine operations was stark. In the early months of the war, submarines ranged aggressively across the Pacific, sinking Allied warships and merchants, shelling coastal installations, even launching small aircraft to drop incendiary bombs on American forests. By 1944, surviving submarines were relegated to supply runs, hauling food, ammunition, and personnel to isolated garrisons cut off by American advances. These missions, contemptuously called Tokyo Express, runs by the Allies, were desperately dangerous. Submarines loaded with rice and torpedoes made slow, surfaced runs to islands like Truk and Rabaul, easy targets for patrolling destroyers. The elite submarine service had been reduced to a logistics force, and even in that role, it was hunted mercilessly. The men who served aboard Japanese submarines were not lacking in courage, skill, or dedication. They were trained warriors, indoctrinated in Bushido, prepared to die for emperor and nation. But courage cannot defeat physics. Skill cannot outmaneuver sound waves traveling at 4,000 feet per second. The invisible walls were not a failure of Japanese spirit or determination. They were the product of a technological and doctrinal gap that proved impossible to close during wartime. The United States had invested heavily in anti-submarine research before the war, recognizing that control of the Atlantic and Pacific sea lanes would be essential to victory. That investment, combined with rapid wartime innovation and mass production of detection equipment, created an anti-submarine network of unprecedented effectiveness. The Japanese, who had prioritized battleships and aircraft carriers, found themselves fighting a kind of war for which they were fundamentally unprepared. In the final year of the war, Japanese submarines attempted one last offensive surge. Operation Hikari, light, deployed submarines equipped with Kaiten, human-guided torpedoes, essentially underwater kamikaze weapons. Young volunteers climbed into the Kaiten, small cylindrical vessels packed with explosives, and were launched from mother submarines toward American anchorages. It was a tactic born of desperation, a final acknowledgement that conventional submarine warfare had failed. The Kaiten attack sank a handful of ships, but cost dozens of lives for minimal strategic effect. Most Kaiten operators died when their weapons malfunctioned, or when the mother submarines carrying them were detected by sonar and destroyed before reaching their targets. The invisible walls claimed them too. The epilogue of this underwater war is written in oil slicks and twisted metal scattered across the Pacific floor. From the Coral Sea to the Philippine Trench, from the waters off Okinawa to the approaches to Tokyo Bay, the wrecks of Japanese submarines lie in darkness, silent monuments to a battle fought without witness. The men who died there, boys who had dreamed of samurai glory, who had written farewell letters to parents they would never see again, who had stood watches in the pre-dawn cold, believing their sacrifice would ensure national survival. They were defeated not by a stronger warrior or a braver foe, but by invisible walls they could not climb, could not breach, could not even fully understand. The sonar ping, that simple metallic echo bouncing through dark water, represented something more profound than tactical advantage. It was the sound of industrial modernity confronting traditional martial culture, of scientific warfare overwhelming spiritual determination. The Americans had turned the ocean, vast, deep, seemingly infinite, into a grid of measured coordinates, a battle space as controlled and observable as a laboratory. They had imposed order on chaos, transparency on mystery. The invisible walls were not physical barriers, but informational ones. They were the walls created by knowledge, by the ability to see what the enemy could not, to know what the enemy could only guess. In that sense, the submarine war in the Pacific was a preview of all modern warfare to come. Conflicts decided not by the courage of individual warriors, but by systems, networks, sensors, and data. There is a deeper truth here about freedom and control. The Japanese submarine crews went to war believing in the vastness of the ocean as a kind of freedom, a space so large that it could not be fully dominated, where stealth and skill could prevail. The Americans demonstrated that even the deepest ocean could be enclosed, measured, and controlled, not with physical barriers, but with knowledge itself. It was a very American approach to warfare. Overwhelm the enemy not with superior spirit, but with superior information, superior systems, superior industrial capacity. The invisible walls were a manifestation of democratic industrialism at its most effective, mass-produced technology wielded by trained specialists, coordinated through open communication networks, adaptable and responsive. Against such a system, courage alone was not enough. Commander Tanabe survived the war, one of the few veteran submarine officers to do so. In post-war interviews, he spoke quietly of those nights beneath the Pacific, of the terrible certainty that came with hearing the sonar ping echoing through the hull. "We knew," he said, "that we were already dead. We just did not know when." That is the final legacy of the invisible walls. Not merely the ships sunk or lives lost, but the psychological weight of fighting an enemy that could see you when you were blind, that could reach you when you could not strike back, that had turned your sanctuary into your tomb. The ocean had become a cage. The walls were invisible, but they were everywhere, and they were absolute.